On October 14, 1983, Thomas Mitchell believed he was simply enjoying another peaceful Saturday morning hike through the dense forests of Western Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. The 42-year-old cartographer from Roanoke had walked these trails dozens of times before, his boots crunching through fallen leaves painted in autumn's brilliant reds and golds. The morning air carried that peculiar crispness unique to mountain elevations, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker hammered against an oak tree with rhythmic persistence. Thomas had no way of knowing that within 3 hours, his routine hike would lead him to discover something that would shake the foundations of American counterintelligence and expose one of the most sophisticated Soviet espionage operations ever conducted on United States soil. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Thomas Mitchell had earned his reputation as one of the most meticulous cartographers at the United States Geological Survey. His colleagues often joked that he could probably draw a detailed map of any terrain blindfolded. Such was his intimate knowledge of topographical features and natural landmarks. That particular Saturday morning, Thomas had decided to explore an unmarked trail that branched off from the Appalachian Trail near Thunder Ridge, roughly 15 miles north of the James River. The trail wasn't on any official map, which immediately piqued his professional curiosity. He'd spotted it during a previous hike, barely visible through thick undergrowth, and had made a mental note to investigate it when he had time. The temperature hovered around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, perfect weather for hiking. Thomas wore his usual gear, sturdy leather boots, worn soft from years of use, dark green hiking pants with multiple pockets, and a faded red flannel shirt under a lightweight jacket. His backpack contained the essentials: water bottles, trail mix, a compass, topographical maps, a small first aid kit, and his trusty Nikon camera. He'd left his house at 6:30 that morning, telling his wife Sarah he'd be back by mid-afternoon. She'd packed him 2 sandwiches and reminded him to be careful, as she always did. Thomas had kissed her goodbye and promised he would. The unmarked trail Thomas now followed wound through increasingly dense forest. Towering oak, maple, and hickory trees formed a canopy so thick that the morning sunlight filtered through in scattered beams, creating an almost cathedral-like atmosphere. The ground beneath his feet was covered in a carpet of fallen leaves, making each step crunch softly. He noticed the trail, though overgrown, showed signs of deliberate construction. Someone had cleared it years ago, maybe even decades. The path followed natural contours in a way that suggested knowledge of efficient trail building, yet it appeared on none of his maps. After hiking for approximately 2 hours, covering what Thomas estimated to be about 4 miles from the Appalachian Trail junction, he noticed something odd. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet. The birds that had been chirping constantly had fallen silent. Even the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth had ceased. Thomas had spent enough time in the wilderness to know this usually meant one of 2 things. Either a predator was nearby, or he was approaching something unnatural that had disturbed the local wildlife. He paused, listening intently, but heard nothing except the whisper of wind through the trees and his own breathing. The trail began to climb more steeply, following a ridgeline that didn't appear on any of his topographical maps. Thomas found this increasingly curious. He'd helped survey much of this region, and unless his memory was completely failing him, this particular ridge shouldn't exist in the location he believed himself to be. He stopped to check his compass and confirmed he was heading northwest, roughly parallel to the main Appalachian Trail, but at a higher elevation. The terrain here was more rugged, with exposed rock formations jutting through the forest floor like ancient bones breaking through skin. Then Thomas saw it, or rather, almost didn't see it. Hidden behind a natural rock outcropping and camouflaged by decades of carefully maintained vegetation was a structure that made absolutely no sense. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than another weathered rock face, perhaps the entrance to a small cave. But Thomas's trained eye caught details that didn't belong, geometric angles too perfect to be natural, a depression in the ground that suggested a deliberately cleared approach path, and most tellingly, the faint outline of what looked like a door frame, expertly disguised but visible if you knew what to look for. His heart rate increased as he approached the structure cautiously. Thomas wasn't a particularly fearful man, but something about the deliberate concealment of this place set off alarm bells in his mind. He moved closer, stepping carefully to avoid making unnecessary noise, though he couldn't have explained why stealth seemed important. The structure was built into the hillside, taking advantage of the natural rock formation to minimize its visible profile. The exterior walls, what little was visible, appeared to be constructed from native stone mortared, together with exceptional skill. Thick moss and lichens covered most surfaces, suggesting the structure had stood here for many years, perhaps since the 1960s or even earlier. Thomas noticed a small window, no larger than a foot square, set high in what he now recognized as the front wall. The glass was so dirty it was nearly opaque, and covered from the inside with what looked like dark fabric or paper. Next to the window, partially hidden by a carefully positioned boulder, was indeed a door. The door was made of thick wood, weathered to blend with the surrounding environment, and secured with a heavy padlock that, unlike everything else, showed no signs of rust or aging. This padlock was modern, maybe only a few years old at most. Thomas stood there for several minutes weighing his options. Every instinct told him this was something he shouldn't be seeing, something that had been hidden for good reason. But his curiosity, the same trait that made him excellent at his job, demanded investigation. He approached the door, noting how solid it appeared, despite the weathered exterior. He tested the padlock gently. It was definitely locked, and appeared to be a high-quality mechanism, not something you'd buy at a hardware store for securing a garden shed. He walked around the structure, discovering it was larger than it initially appeared. The building extended back into the hillside, taking advantage of the natural cave formation behind the rock outcropping. Thomas estimated the structure was roughly 30 feet deep and maybe 20 feet wide, though most of it was underground or built into the hill itself. At the rear, he found ventilation pipes, cunningly disguised as natural fissures in the rock, but clearly man-made upon close inspection. These pipes suggested the interior had been designed for long-term occupancy. Thomas pulled out his camera and began documenting everything he could see. He photographed the exterior from multiple angles, the door and its modern padlock, the ventilation system, the window, and the surrounding terrain. Through his camera's viewfinder, he noticed something else, a barely visible path leading away from the structure, heading further up the ridge. This path was even more overgrown than the one he'd followed to get here, suggesting it hadn't been used in some time. Making a decision, Thomas decided to follow this second path. It climbed steeply for perhaps a quarter-mile before reaching a flat area on the ridgetop. Here, hidden under a tarpaulin that had been carefully camouflaged with branches and leaves, Thomas found something that made his blood run cold. An antenna array. Not a simple radio antenna like hunters might use, but a sophisticated system with multiple directional elements, all pointing generally northeast. Even to Thomas's untrained eye, this looked like serious communications equipment. Near the antenna, he found remnants of other equipment, partially buried and covered with tarps. He carefully pulled back one tarp, revealing what appeared to be a portable generator, old but well-maintained. Next to it were several jerry cans, presumably for fuel. This wasn't some abandoned hunting cabin or forgotten Forest Service outpost. This was an operational site, or at least had been until recently. Thomas's mind raced through possibilities. The Cold War had officially ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, just 6 years earlier, but tensions between the United States and Russia remained high. He'd read enough about espionage in history books to recognize that what he was looking at bore all the hallmarks of an intelligence collection site. The location was perfect, remote, elevated, with clear sightlines to the northeast, which would point toward Washington, D.C., approximately 150 miles away. He checked his watch. It was 11:45 in the morning. Thomas needed to make a decision. He could continue documenting what he'd found and report it to local authorities, or he could leave immediately and pretend he'd never been here. The latter option felt like cowardice, but the former might put him in danger if the site was still active. The modern padlock suggested someone still visited this place, even if infrequently. Thomas decided to document everything thoroughly before leaving. He took dozens of photographs, made detailed notes about the structure's location using landmarks and compass bearings, and even sketched a rough map. He was careful not to disturb anything significantly, working under the assumption that whoever owned this place might return and would notice if things had been moved. As he worked, Thomas began noticing more details that supported his espionage theory. Near the entrance, partially hidden under leaves, he found the rusted remains of what looked like a diplomatic license plate from the Soviet embassy in Washington. It was old, dating from the 1970s, based on the design, and had been deliberately bent and partially destroyed, as if someone had tried to make it unrecognizable, but enough remained to clearly identify its origin. Thomas photographed the plate carefully, his hands trembling slightly. This was real. This was actual evidence of Soviet activity, not just speculation. He continued his search, finding other small items that told a story. A crushed cigarette pack with Cyrillic writing so faded and old that the brand name was barely legible. A rusted can that once contained food, with Russian labeling still partially visible. These were small things, easily overlooked, but together they painted a clear picture. By 1:15 in the afternoon, Thomas had documented everything he could find without actually breaking into the structure. He'd taken over 100 photographs and filled several pages of his notebook with detailed observations. The sun had climbed higher, and the forest had come alive again with bird calls and the sounds of small animals moving through the undergrowth. Thomas realized he'd been so focused on his discovery that he'd lost track of time. Sarah would start worrying if he didn't head back soon. He took one last long look at the hidden structure, committing every detail to memory. Then he turned and began the long hike back, moving quickly but carefully, constantly checking over his shoulder. The forest felt different now, as if it was watching him. Every snapping twig made him jump. Every bird call seemed like a warning signal. Thomas told himself he was being paranoid, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled onto something dangerous. The hike back to his car took nearly 3 hours. Thomas pushed himself harder than usual, driven by a growing sense of urgency. When he finally reached his vehicle, a blue Ford pickup truck parked at a trailhead off a remote forest road, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. Everything looked exactly as he'd left it, undisturbed. He threw his backpack in the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove toward Roanoke, his mind churning through what he should do next. Sarah was in the kitchen when he arrived home at 4:30 that afternoon. She took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. Thomas wasn't good at hiding his emotions, a trait she'd always found endearing. He asked her to sit down, then told her everything he'd discovered. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. When Thomas finished, Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke carefully, choosing her words with precision. She worked as a paralegal at a law firm in Roanoke and had developed good instincts about when situations required professional intervention. She told Thomas he needed to contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately. Not the local police, not the Forest Service, but the FBI. This was clearly a matter of national security, and local authorities might not have the resources or expertise to handle it properly. Thomas agreed. He'd reached the same conclusion during his drive home. The next morning, Sunday, October 15th, he called the FBI's field office in Richmond, Virginia. After being transferred through several operators and explaining his story multiple times, he finally reached Special Agent David Harrison, who was on duty that weekend. Harrison listened to Thomas's account with growing interest, asking detailed questions about the location, the structure, and what Thomas had observed. Harrison told Thomas to secure all his photographs and notes, not to discuss his discovery with anyone else, and to expect a visit from FBI agents within 24 hours. True to his word, on Monday morning, October 16th, at 8:30 in the morning, 2 FBI agents arrived at Thomas's house. Special Agent Harrison had driven up from Richmond, accompanied by Special Agent Jennifer Chen, who specialized in counterintelligence operations. They spent 3 hours interviewing Thomas, examining his photographs, and reviewing his detailed notes and sketches. The agents were professional, but clearly excited by what Thomas had found. Agent Chen explained that the FBI had long suspected the Soviets maintained several clandestine facilities in the United States, but locating them was extraordinarily difficult. The Soviets were masters of camouflage and operational security. What Thomas had discovered could be one of these suspected sites. The agents asked Thomas to return to the site with them, but not immediately. They needed to assemble a proper team, including technical specialists, who could properly document and analyze the facility. They also needed to conduct surveillance to determine if the site was still being actively used. The modern padlock suggested it might be, which would make the discovery even more valuable. If they could identify who was accessing the site, they might uncover an entire espionage network. Over the following 2 weeks, Thomas worked closely with the FBI. He provided additional details about the site's location, helped them understand the terrain, and answered countless questions about what he'd observed. The FBI conducted aerial surveillance using aircraft equipped with infrared cameras, trying to detect any heat signatures that might indicate recent activity. They also positioned remote cameras near the site, carefully hidden to avoid detection. On October 28, 1983, the FBI was finally ready to conduct a full investigation of the site. They assembled a team of 15 people, FBI agents, counterintelligence specialists, technical experts, and Thomas as a guide. They approached the location before dawn, moving quietly through the forest in small groups to avoid detection. Thomas led the first group, which included agents Harrison and Chen, along with 2 technical specialists carrying sophisticated electronic detection equipment. When they reached the site, everything appeared exactly as Thomas had left it 2 weeks earlier. The padlock was still in place undisturbed. The FBI's cameras had detected no visitors to the site during their surveillance period. This suggested the facility was no longer actively used, at least not recently. However, they would proceed with caution. Cold War-era spy operations often included security measures designed to detect and deter intruders. A FBI locksmith worked on the padlock for 15 minutes before successfully opening it, without leaving obvious traces of tampering. Agent Harrison was the first to enter, followed by Agent Chen and 2 other agents, all with weapons drawn. Thomas waited outside with the remaining team members, his heart pounding. After several minutes that felt like hours, Agent Harrison emerged and signaled that the site was clear. There was no one inside and no immediate security threats. Thomas was invited to enter, accompanied by Agents Harrison and Chen. What they found inside was remarkable. The structure consisted of 3 rooms, all carved into the hillside and reinforced with concrete and steel. The main room was approximately 15 feet by 20 feet and served as a combination living quarters and operations center. Against one wall stood a sophisticated shortwave radio system, old but apparently well-maintained. Multiple frequencies were marked in Cyrillic notation on a chart mounted above the radio. The second room, smaller, appeared to be a sleeping area with 2 narrow beds, a small table, and a portable heater. The beds were made with military precision, blankets pulled tight with hospital corners. On the table sat a kerosene lamp, matches, and a Russian-English dictionary. The third room was the most interesting. It served as a combination storage area and dark room for developing photographs. Shelves lined with supplies took up most of the space: canned food with Russian labels, bottled water, batteries, fuel canisters, medical supplies, and camera equipment. Agent Chen immediately focused on a metal filing cabinet in the operations room. It was locked, but the FBI locksmith made quick work of it. Inside, they found treasure trove of intelligence material. There were dozens of folders containing photographs of military installations, government buildings, and infrastructure targets throughout Virginia and nearby states. There were detailed maps marked with routes and timing information. There were code books for encrypted communications. And most importantly, there were personnel files. These files contained information on individuals the Soviets had identified as potential intelligence sources. Some were low-level government employees, others worked for defense contractors, a few were academics at universities with classified research programs. Each file included photographs, biographical information, personal habits, vulnerabilities that might be exploited, and in some cases notes indicating the individual had been successfully recruited and was providing information to Soviet handlers. Agent Harrison looked through one file, and his expression darkened. He called over another agent and showed him the documents. The agent's face went pale. They'd found something significant, something that went beyond just identifying an abandoned spy post. Thomas couldn't see what was in the file, but he could tell from the agent's reactions that it was serious. The FBI team spent the entire day documenting the site. They photographed everything, catalogued all materials, carefully removed the files and equipment for analysis, and collected samples for forensic examination. Technical specialists examined the radio equipment and determined it was a high-end Soviet-made system, capable of both receiving and transmitting encrypted messages over long distances. The antenna array Thomas had found on the ridge would have given the system excellent range, easily reaching listening stations in the Soviet Union or at their embassy in Washington. As the investigation progressed, a picture emerged of how the facility had operated. Based on dates found in various documents and logs, the site had been established sometime in the mid-1960s, likely during the height of Cold War tensions. It had been used as a safe house and communications hub for Soviet intelligence officers operating in the region. These officers would have posed as diplomats or trade officials, giving them legal cover to be in the United States, but they would conduct illegal espionage activities during their time here. The facility had apparently been quite active through the 1970s and into the early 1980s. The most recent dated documents were from 1982, suggesting the site had been abandoned or placed in dormant status approximately a year before Thomas discovered it. This timing coincided with a period when the FBI had significantly increased counterintelligence pressure on known Soviet intelligence officers, making it riskier for them to conduct operations. The modern padlock that had caught Thomas's attention was explained by a maintenance log found in one of the files. Someone, presumably a Soviet intelligence officer or perhaps the American collaborator, had visited the site in April 1983, just 6 months before Thomas's discovery. The purpose of that visit had been to check on the facility's condition and replace the old, rusting padlock with a new one. The visitor had noted in the log that the facility was in good condition and could be reactivated if needed. This suggested the Soviets viewed the site as an asset they might use again in the future. One detail that particularly disturbed the FBI investigators was a map they found showing multiple similar sites throughout the Blue Ridge Mountains and nearby areas. The map used coded symbols, but analysis suggested there might be as many as 8 other facilities, similar to the one Thomas had discovered, all within a 200-mile radius of Washington, D.C. These sites would form a network, allowing Soviet intelligence officers to operate across a wide area, while maintaining secure bases where they could hide, communicate with Moscow, store equipment, and meet with recruited sources. The FBI immediately began searching for these other sites based on the information from the map. Over the following months, they would discover 4 more facilities, each similar to Thomas's discovery, though varying in size and sophistication. 2 were in Virginia, 1 in West Virginia, and 1 in Maryland. All had been established during the Cold War and appeared to have been abandoned around the same time as the site Thomas had found. The discovery of these facilities was one of the most significant counterintelligence breakthroughs of the 1980s. The personnel files found at the site led to several investigations. The FBI identified 12 individuals who appeared to have been actively providing information to the Soviets. 3 were arrested and eventually convicted of espionage. The others were either impossible to prosecute due to lack of current evidence, had already died, or had ceased their activities years earlier. The investigations were kept classified for many years, with the public only learning limited details through occasional news reports about espionage arrests that seemed unconnected but were actually part of the larger investigation. For Thomas Mitchell, life changed in ways he never anticipated. The FBI asked him to keep his discovery completely secret, not even telling friends or extended family. Only Sarah knew the full story. Thomas agreed, understanding the need for operational security. However, the FBI also wanted to reward his civic duty and keen observation. They hired him as a consultant, using his topographical expertise to help search for the other suspected Soviet facilities indicated on the map. Over the next 18 months, Thomas worked part-time with the FBI, using his knowledge of terrain and his exceptional ability to read landscapes to identify likely locations for hidden facilities. He helped locate 3 of the 4 additional sites the FBI eventually discovered. The work was fascinating but stressful. Thomas developed a nervous habit of constantly checking his surroundings, wondering if he was being watched. The FBI assured him that the Soviet network in the area had been thoroughly disrupted. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, someone was angry about what he'd uncovered. In 1985, the FBI officially thanked Thomas for his assistance and released him from his consultant role. They told him the major threat had been addressed, though some investigations were ongoing. They also informed him that his discovery had led to significant improvements in understanding Soviet espionage methods and had helped the FBI develop better strategies for locating and neutralizing clandestine facilities. Thomas received a letter of commendation from the FBI director, though it was classified, and he couldn't tell anyone about it. Thomas tried to return to his normal life, but he found himself forever changed by the experience. He could no longer hike his favorite trails without remembering what he'd found and wondering what else might be hidden in the vast forests. Every unmarked trail now seemed potentially significant. Every unusual structure deserved investigation. Sarah joked that he'd developed a spy's mentality, always suspicious, always watching. Thomas didn't find it funny because he knew it was true. Years later, after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, some details about the facilities Thomas had discovered were declassified. Journalists wrote articles about the Blue Ridge spy network, though Thomas's name was never mentioned publicly at his request. The stories described how Soviet intelligence had established a sophisticated network of safe houses and communications posts throughout the region, operating for nearly 3 decades before being discovered. The articles praised the FBI's work in uncovering and dismantling the network, but said nothing about the hiker whose chance discovery had started it all. In 2003, 20 years after his discovery, Thomas finally told the full story to his adult children. They'd known their father had done some consulting work for the FBI years ago, but they'd never known the details. Thomas's son, a history teacher, was fascinated and wanted to write about it. Thomas agreed on the condition that the story wasn't published until after his death. He still worried, perhaps irrationally, about potential repercussions from elements of the old Soviet intelligence apparatus. The facility Thomas discovered was eventually destroyed by the FBI. They removed all equipment and materials, thoroughly documented the site, and then demolished the structure and sealed the entrance. The official reason was to prevent it from being used by others, but there was also concern about it becoming a target for souvenir hunters or curiosity seekers if its location became known. Today, if you knew exactly where to look in the forests of Western Virginia, you might find the remains of the rock outcropping, but no trace of the structure that once stood there. The story of Thomas Mitchell's discovery illustrates several important aspects of Cold War espionage. First, it demonstrates the extensive nature of Soviet intelligence operations in the United States. The Soviets didn't just operate out of their embassy in Washington or their consulates in major cities. They established hidden facilities throughout the country, creating a deep network that could operate even if their official diplomatic presence was compromised. Second, the discovery showed the importance of careful reconnaissance and preparation in intelligence work. The facilities Thomas found were constructed with remarkable attention to detail. They were camouflaged so effectively that they'd gone undetected for decades, despite being located in areas that received regular visits from hikers, hunters, and Forest Service personnel. Only someone with Thomas's trained eye for topography and persistent curiosity would have noticed the subtle signs that something wasn't right. Third, the case highlighted the value of citizen vigilance. Thomas wasn't a spy catcher or a counterintelligence professional. He was an ordinary American who noticed something unusual and had the courage to report it. The FBI's ability to dismantle a significant Soviet espionage network started with one person's decision to investigate an unmarked trail and report what he found. The personnel files discovered at the site also revealed the human cost of espionage. Many of the Americans identified in those files had been recruited through manipulation and coercion rather than ideological conviction. They'd been trapped by the Soviets exploiting personal weaknesses, financial troubles, marital problems, career disappointments, or simple loneliness. Once recruited, they found themselves unable to escape, threatened with exposure if they tried to stop providing information. Some had lived with this burden for years, the stress destroying their health, their relationships, and their peace of mind. The technical capabilities revealed at the site also impressed intelligence analysts. The radio equipment, though old by 1980s standards, was sophisticated and well-maintained. It allowed secure encrypted communications with Moscow and with other Soviet intelligence stations. The Soviets had clearly invested significant resources in establishing and maintaining these facilities, viewing them as valuable assets worth the risk and expense. Historians studying the Cold War have since recognized that facilities like the one Thomas discovered represented a significant security challenge for the United States. During the height of the Cold War, from the 1950s through the 1980s, the FBI estimated that the Soviets maintained hundreds of intelligence officers in the United States under diplomatic cover, supported by an unknown number of clandestine officers operating without official protection. These officers ran operations targeting military secrets, technological information, political intelligence, and government communications. The network Thomas helped uncover focused primarily on military intelligence. The facility's location in Western Virginia placed it within relatively easy reach of numerous targets. The Pentagon and other defense installations in the Washington area, military bases throughout Virginia, the naval facilities at Norfolk, and the Appalachian areas used for military training exercises. The photographs and documents found at the site showed the Soviets had been systematically collecting information about force deployments, military capabilities, transportation infrastructure, and communications networks. One particularly disturbing aspect of the discovered materials was evidence of Soviet interest in continuity of government plans. The Soviets had apparently identified and mapped numerous locations where senior government officials were supposed to relocate in case of nuclear war. These included known facilities like Mount Weather in Virginia and Raven Rock in Pennsylvania, but also less well-known sites. This information would have been invaluable to Soviet military planners developing targeting strategies for a potential nuclear conflict. The FBI's investigation of the facility and the leads it generated continued for several years after the initial discovery. By the time the investigation was considered complete in 1989, it had resulted in 12 espionage prosecutions, dozens of security revocations for individuals found to have compromised information, and significant changes to security procedures at multiple government agencies and defense contractors. The investigation also identified numerous American citizens who had been approached by Soviet intelligence but had refused to cooperate. These individuals were interviewed, debriefed, and in some cases provided valuable information about Soviet recruitment methods. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 rendered much of the discovered intelligence historical rather than operational, but it remained valuable for understanding how the Soviets had operated during the Cold War. The facilities Thomas discovered and the documents found within them provided unprecedented insight into Soviet intelligence tradecraft. Intelligence agencies studied the materials extensively, using them to train new counterintelligence officers and to improve methods for detecting and countering espionage operations. Thomas Mitchell never received public recognition for his discovery. He lived out his life quietly in Roanoke, continuing to work as a cartographer until his retirement in 2001. He died in 2017 at the age of 76, having kept the full details of his discovery secret for over 3 decades. At his funeral, a representative from the FBI approached his family and presented them with a formal letter of appreciation, finally acknowledging publicly Thomas's contribution to national security. The story of Thomas Mitchell and his accidental discovery serves as a reminder that history often turns on small moments and unexpected discoveries. If Thomas had chosen a different trail that October morning, if he'd been less observant, if he'd decided the unmarked path wasn't worth investigating, the Soviet facility might have remained hidden for many more years. The espionage network it supported might have continued operating, potentially compromising more secrets and putting more lives at risk. The facility itself, though now destroyed, represented a fascinating intersection of Cold War history, intelligence operations, and the American wilderness. It stood for nearly 30 years, hidden in plain sight, a secret kept by stone and forest. It saw intelligence officers come and go, heard encrypted messages transmitted to Moscow, stored secrets that could have altered the course of history. And then, one October morning, an ordinary man taking an ordinary hike stumbled upon it and changed everything. Thomas's discovery also highlighted an interesting aspect of intelligence work, the importance of terrain and geography. The Soviets chose the location brilliantly. It was remote enough to avoid detection, but accessible enough to be useful. It was elevated, providing good radio communications. It was near major transportation routes, but not so near that unusual traffic would be noticed. It was in an area with legitimate reasons for people to be present, hiking trails and Forest Service roads, so visitors wouldn't automatically seem suspicious. The facility's design showed sophisticated understanding of both operational security and the physical environment. The FBI's exploitation of the materials found at the site continued to bear fruit for years. In the mid-1990s, after the Soviet archives began opening following the USSR's collapse, American intelligence analysts compared the documents found in Thomas's facility with newly available Soviet intelligence records. The comparison confirmed that the facility had been more important than initially believed. It had served not just as a safe house and communications post, but as a regional coordination center for Soviet intelligence operations throughout the mid-Atlantic region. One particular revelation from this archival research stunned analysts. The facility had apparently been visited in 1969 by a very senior Soviet intelligence officer, possibly even the head of their American Operations Directorate. This visit had occurred during a period of intense Cold War tensions and suggested the Soviets viewed their Blue Ridge network as critically important to their intelligence collection efforts. The fact that such a senior officer would risk visiting a clandestine facility indicated both the network's value and the Soviets' confidence in its security. The story also illustrates the psychological pressures of living with important secrets. Thomas spent over 3 decades unable to discuss the most interesting thing that had ever happened to him with anyone except Sarah and a few FBI agents. He couldn't tell his children, his friends, or his co-workers. He couldn't share the story at parties or write about it in his memoirs. The burden of secrecy weighed on him, especially as he aged and natural instinct prompted him to share his life experiences with younger generations. Sarah, Thomas's wife, felt these pressures too. She'd been present for all the FBI interviews, had watched her husband work as a consultant for the Bureau, had seen him struggle with stress and paranoia in the years following the discovery. She'd kept the secret as faithfully as Thomas, never once revealing what he'd found, even when doing so might have seemed harmless, or when the temptation to share became strong. Their shared secret became, in a way, a bond that strengthened their marriage. They alone understood what Thomas had discovered and why it mattered. In the broader context of Cold War history, Thomas's discovery came at an interesting moment. By 1983, the Cold War was entering its final phase, though no one knew it at the time. The Soviet economy was straining under the burden of military spending and economic inefficiency. Mikhail Gorbachev would come to power in 1985 and begin implementing reforms that would ultimately lead to the Soviet Union's collapse. But in 1983, tensions remained high, with both sides still viewing each other as existential threats. The discovery of the Soviet facility network created internal debate within the American intelligence community about how to respond. Some argued for quiet dismantlement, removing the facilities without letting the Soviets know they'd been discovered, thereby possibly learning more about Soviet operations. Others argued for public exposure, using the discoveries to embarrass the Soviets and put pressure on them to reduce their intelligence activities. Ultimately, a middle course was chosen: quiet dismantlement, combined with increased counterintelligence pressure on known Soviet intelligence officers, making it more difficult and risky for them to operate. The facilities Thomas helped discover weren't the only Soviet safe houses in the United States, but they were among the most sophisticated. Other facilities were discovered over the years, some in urban areas where they could blend into the surrounding neighborhoods, others in remote locations similar to the Blue Ridge site. Each discovery added to the understanding of how extensively the Soviets had prepared to conduct intelligence operations on American soil. From a counterintelligence perspective, Thomas's discovery validated certain theories about Soviet operations that had been suspected but never proven. Intelligence analysts had long believed the Soviets maintained facilities outside their known establishments, but proving it was difficult. The physical evidence Thomas found, combined with the documents and equipment, provided concrete confirmation. This allowed the FBI and other agencies to focus their counterintelligence efforts more effectively, knowing that such facilities existed and understanding how they operated. The maps showing the network of facilities raised a troubling question. Were there more sites that had never been discovered? The FBI's searches found several additional facilities based on the map from Thomas's site, but were there others the map didn't show? Or networks in other parts of the country following similar patterns? These questions kept counterintelligence officers occupied for years, leading to systematic searches in other areas where similar facilities might exist. Some searches proved fruitful, others didn't, but the effort itself demonstrated how seriously the government took the threat. For historians studying the Cold War, the materials recovered from these facilities provided invaluable primary source documentation about Soviet intelligence methods, priorities, and successes. Academic researchers gained access to some of this material after it was declassified, leading to numerous scholarly articles and books that provided new insights into Cold War espionage. The facilities themselves, though destroyed, were documented so thoroughly that historians could reconstruct how they operated and what role they played in the larger Soviet intelligence effort. The environmental aspect of the story is also noteworthy. The Soviets had constructed and operated these facilities in the United States without causing significant environmental damage or attracting attention from environmental groups or Forest Service personnel. This required careful planning and discipline. The facilities were designed to leave minimal footprints, with waste disposed of carefully, fuel stored safely, and operations conducted quietly. In a twisted way, the Soviets had practiced a form of low-impact camping, leaving no trace of their presence except the structures themselves. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.